Hello, and welcome to a training session on the planning templates developed for the Minnesota Department of Transportation's 5-year strategic transit plans. These plans were developed for each of the rural transit systems throughout the state, and MnDOT created templates to be used for all of the 5-year transit plans. These templates provide consistency among the plans, and they provide a planning tool for you to use for your service planning, budgeting, and to assist you with development of your grant applications. Today we will be looking at 4 templates which are common to all of the plans, and we'll explain how you can use these in your planning process. To begin, my name is A.T. Stoddard. I am with LSC Transportation Consultants, and our office is located in Colorado Springs. Our firm was responsible for preparing the templates for the Northwest region. As I mentioned, we'll get just with a brief introduction to the templates, and then we will look at the templates for the rural transit needs and demand analysis, capital budgeting, operating budgets, and your 5-year service financial plan. These templates are all related and, again, are included in your plan, but the template spreadsheet files have been provided to you for your use in the future. As we begin, let's look at the templates for the rural transit needs and demand. This is taken from the Transit Cooperative Research Program Report 161, titled Methods for Forecasting Demand and Quantifying Need for Rural Passenger Transportation. The publication is actually a workbook which walks you through the steps to develop the estimates of transit needs and demand. We will be looking at the spreadsheet template, which is based on the tools in the workbook. However, I would strongly recommend that you obtain a copy of this workbook so that you understand the different approaches to estimating demand, the numbers that are going into the spreadsheet. And while the spreadsheet is a very useful tool and makes the analysis easy, the report gives a good explanation of what is behind the calculations in the spreadsheet. I have included the link to the document on the slide. However, I would suggest that it's much easier if you just do an internet search for TCRP Report 161. That will take you to the page where the document can be downloaded as a PDF for your use. There is no charge for these. These are funded by the Federal Transit Administration through the Transportation Research Board, and are reports of research conducted to give you information that you can use in your jobs. When you first open the spreadsheet template, you will come to the page that indicates instructions. There are several things here that you can read over, and it tells you what to do. The one thing I do want to point out is at the top of the page, you'll see this yellow band, and it has a security warning. It says macro options have been disabled. You can click on the options, and it tells you that the security signature is not one that's from Microsoft, basically, and therefore they don't think it's valid. I can assure you that it has been tested, and the security signature is safe. There's no information. It's just a macro that allows you to reset. You can click OK, and it will then allow you to use the spreadsheet. There's also at the bottom of this page, says you can click on the blue macro instructions tab, which would appear when you download this, and get instructions on how to deal with the macros. Hopefully that will not be a problem for you. It was a change that occurred with updates to Excel and is nothing that you need to worry about. We'll proceed now through the pages in the template and what you can use. The first tab we'll go to is the analysis setup. In the cells on this page, you can add information about your service area, the transit system, the description of the analysis. So in this case, we said 5-year service plan. You might want to look at expansion to a new community or a new county, and you can just document that in these 2 cells. All they are used for is headings on the pages, particularly with the output, and if you want to print any of the output. At this point, you can select the different analysis procedures that you would like to use. We are going to look at several of these which may be useful for you and that we used in developing the 5-year transit plans. The first shows the need in terms of number of persons. This looks at the number of people that would be expected to have a transportation need in your area. The second is the number of trips, and this gives you a rough idea of the number of trips that people would make if they had cars for households who do not have access to a car. And so again, it's a good indication of an upper bound, if you will, of the potential demand within your area, given what the needs for transportation might be. The next we have left unchecked. This is for program trips. I will talk a little bit more about that as we look at the input and output pages. But in this case, we have not included program trips in our analysis. The next 2 are for general public demand. There are 2 methods of estimating this based on different inputs, and it can give you a range that you might expect for your system. The next one we have left unchecked. This is for small city fixed route services. This is for urban center populations that are less than 50,000 people and have revenue hours of service under 20,000 per year on a fixed route service. We left this unchecked as most of the rural systems in Minnesota do not operate a true fixed route service, but rather if they are operating a route, it is a flexible route or route deviation service, and that operates much more like demand response. The final checkbox is for demand by transit to an urban center. This applies in a few locations where there are rural counties with commuters traveling to an urban place. And again, there is a note here that the total commuters have to at least be 10,000 for this model to be valid. That is just our setup page. Again, you can check whichever of the blocks you would like for the analysis that you want to complete. And once you have checked those boxes, we move to the Input tab to then start entering data. This is where the workbook may really be helpful because it refers to tables in the American Community Survey, places to get data, and you'll need to pull that data. So looking at the information in the workbook may be helpful in finding that information off the census website. As we begin, we'll start at the upper left, and we have transit need inputs. And what we are looking at is a calculation of the number of people residing in households with income below the poverty level. This number, shown right here, 6,530, comes from calculation and information reported in the census. The next blocks are where we are calculating the number of people residing in households who do not own vehicles. And so we have identified 1-person households, 2-person, 3, 4 or more without vehicles. That then gives us a calculation for the number of persons residing in those households. The next block is for the census region. There are different rates of trip making by region, and so you enter your state, in this case Minnesota, from the drop-down list, and as you'll see, that appears as a drop down. You can pick any state, but Minnesota, that uses rates that are common to your region for calculating what is called the mobility gap. That mobility gap is just the difference between how many trips people make in households with cars compared to those households which do not have cars. And there, as you can imagine, is a significant difference between the number of trips people are able to make. The next blue line indicates general public rural non-program trips. And as I mentioned, this is one approach. The calculation in this case uses the senior population, age 60 and above, in this case just over 6,600. We also give the American Community Survey table number where you can find that data. Then it includes the mobility limited population, again from census data. This is the population age 18 to 64 with a limitation, and then persons living in households with no vehicles available. Our next block is another calculation for rural passenger transportation, and this is taken from the need calculated in this block, and then the annual vehicle miles of service. So this introduces then a level of service being provided. So you enter your annual revenue miles, and the need will come from the calculation for the mobility gap. So in order to do this, you do have to check the box on the previous page when we go back to analysis setup that says we need to look at this need with the number of trips. Then the data under transit need inputs would be included so that that calculation can be made. Then we have the small city fixed route inputs. As I said, we have left this off. If we had checked the box previously, and I'll show you what happens when we do that, we would then fill in the data in these blocks. So let me go back to the analysis setup. I will now check the box for demand for small city fixed route. We will go to the input page, and you'll see now those boxes are no longer grayed out. They are open and you can enter data. When we uncheck that box, then the data entry blocks are grayed out and you are not able to enter the data in those. So the fields on this form that you can fill in are related to what you have chosen for the analysis. Also point out that the calculation for the small city fixed route is based on not only just the population and revenue hours of service provided, but you can see college and university enrollment. In communities under 50,000 population, the presence of a residential university or college with 5,000 students or more has a significant bearing on the level of demand for public transit. And so that is something that would be included if you are doing this analysis. Then we have the demand for commuters by transit to an urban center. I mentioned this is where you have a true urbanized area, population over 50,000, but people commuting from a rural county, and you calculate this based on the total number of commuters. These are not the transit commuters, but rather the total number of commuters, the distance from the rural county to the urban center. And then if it is a state capital, you check the box because there is actually a different relationship for people commuting to state capitals. Finally, on the right, you can see we have program demand inputs. This is used if your system has a significant amount of service provided for human services programs. If you have coordinated services and you are providing program trips or trips under a contract with a coordinated program, you can estimate the number of trips for each of these individual programs. This is different from the general public service, which includes people who have disabilities or maybe elderly but are traveling on their own and setting the time schedule for themselves. When people are participating in a program, their travel is defined by the characteristics of that program, whether they're arriving for some kind of activity or congregate meal, any of those activities, specific programs. And so to calculate this, and we won't go through that, but if it applies to your system, you would want to check that box. You enter the program name, just a description of the type of program, and then you have to have some more detailed information. So we're looking at the number of program participants, how many events a week, and so as an example, some senior centers have congregate meals 5 days a week, others may have 2 days a week, or even just 1 day a week. And so we need to know the number of events held each week. Then the number, or rather the percentage of participants who attend on an average day. So there may be 100 people participating in the program, but we only have 35 on an average day. And so we would have 35% in that case that we would enter here. Then we need to include the percentage of participants who are transit dependent or who are likely to use transit. And this varies significantly from program to program. Some people are transit dependent. The only way they can participate in the program is to use the transportation service offered. In other locations, the people have the option, and I have seen senior centers where the parking lots are overflowing because virtually everyone drives, and only a handful of people may actually use the transportation service. And then the last column is for the number of weeks the program is offered. And with this information, we are able then to calculate a total number of annual trips for that program. Now that we have entered data on our input tab, what we will do is go to the output tab where we see the results. So this is the calculation, and as we look at this, you can see the information you entered on the first analysis setup tab, your transit system, why you're doing this analysis, any notes you make. And then as we look at the results, we see the calculation of the estimated need, in this case 7,000 individuals. We have an estimate of the number of households without access to a vehicle. The mobility gap, that is 2.1 one-way passenger trips per household, the difference between those households with vehicles and those without, or an estimate of the annual one-way passenger trips, in this case 247,000. Then you can see the results from our estimates of the general public transportation demand using the two methods. And as with any of these are estimates, and so this would tell you we can easily see a range of 28,000 to 50,000 one-way passenger trips as part of this system. As we go down, again, we did not check the small city fixed route, so we have no result. That is grayed out. And finally, we have an estimate of our annual one-way passenger trips for a commuter service into an urban center. So these give you estimates of what the demand may be, using the different methods and for different types of service. This can be very useful when you look at particularly the general public, rural, if you're considering new service in a community. If you have existing service and you're making changes, these approaches are not as good as some others, and so we will take a look at those. Finally, just to scroll down, I want to show you that, again, we have a block for rural program demand, and if we had checked those boxes and filled in information, that would show up in these cells. Next, we're going to go to the tab labeled Peer Data Worksheet. And this one is one I think is very useful. If you can find peer systems that are comparable in many ways, and the communities are comparable, you can come up with reasonable estimates of the level of demand or the range. And I would highly recommend that when you're looking at changes in your service or extension of your service, that the best peer system you have is your own. Whatever your trip rate is, potentially in passengers per hour of service, extension of something similar into similar areas will probably have the same level of usage, and that may be your best estimate of the demand for those new services. In this case, we selected 3 peer systems, and you can see we then filled in information for these 3. The table is set up so you can add additional systems if you desire, and you can see population ranging for the service area from about 60,000 to 127,000. That's a pretty good sized range, maybe larger than you might want, but I want you to see the spread and some of what that does for the calculations. The size of the area served, their service area in square miles, is included. Then the annual vehicle miles of service, annual vehicle hours of service, and this you can see a little closer in terms of the range, somewhat more similar systems, although the service area population is quite a bit different in these systems. And then the existing number of one-way trips served per year. And you can see in this case, very interesting, our county with the highest population actually has the lowest number of trips served. But again, that will help give us a good range of the estimates. Then we enter in these cells that are highlighted in yellow, the data for your system. What is your service area population? How many vehicle miles of service are you providing? Or if you're considering additional service, how many are you looking to provide? And how many annual vehicle hours of service will you be providing? The rest of our table then gives us a range of demand estimates based on the factors that we have highlighted in yellow. So based on the population or trips per capita, the trip rate, we have a maximum, an average, a median range, and a minimum amount. The median in this case, because we only have 3, is probably not the best representation. But whatever you put in, it will do the calculation giving us that range. And then you'll have to make some judgment as to where you fall in terms of that range. Because our population numbers varied so much, we have a pretty high range here. Then we also have estimates based on vehicle miles provided. And you can see the range, again, minimum to maximum provided there with the estimates. And then under the column annual vehicle hours, a range of estimate provided there based on our peer systems. Then the values expected for my system is shown below. And so these are calculated based on the information up above. And so we have, again, that range, what would be the maximum, average, median, and minimum value for your particular system. And because we only have the 3, numbers are very similar to what we have up above, but in this case, this is giving you estimates for your service. Understanding that that is a pretty broad range. If you have that broader range, you might want to go back and reconsider some of the peer systems you're looking at. But the peer system comparison can be one of your best methods for estimating the demand for service. But again, being careful which peer systems you actually choose. I would now like to turn and talk about the 5-year financial service plan that is included as a template and documented in your 5-year plan. This includes an unconstrained plan, a financially constrained plan, and I'm going to talk a little bit about updating that financial plan. So we'll begin by looking at the financial plan. We're going to look at the unconstrained tab, which then shows us what is the service that would be implemented and capital needs over the next 5 years in this particular plan. As you can see, we have 2018, 19, and now we are moving forward from 2020 to 25 when these plans were developed. First line is continuing the status quo operations, and so that is brought forward with an inflation factor. And then we come down to service enhancements. In this case, we're looking at new staffing, hiring a supervisor and dispatcher, planning to start that in 2020, and then that increases based on the inflation factor each year. We have some other service options, and so our new service on the first line is to add Saturday service, and you can see that is projected to start in 2022 and move forward. And we then have other service options and enhancements that we would include. We get then to capital costs, and the first line we have here are replacement vehicles, and so those are projected out each year with some vehicles being purchased annually. In this case, there were upgrades to a camera system for buses, and then looking at vehicle storage facilities and potentially expanding a maintenance facility. The numbers shown here over 3 years reflect that in 2020, we would start doing the planning, the environmental review, and getting approvals, moving into 2021 to have the design completed for the facility, and then funding the full facility construction in 2022. At the bottom, there's a line that shows the funding gap, and that is the difference between what we have in the status quo, maintenance of service, and the various enhancements over the years. With that, we'll move to the constrained plan, which is where your plan should be more realistic in terms of what you can do, coming back from the desired enhancements. And so again, we'll start at the top of this table. We have the status quo operating costs. Those are brought forward, and we have indicated a 3% increase year to year for this particular system. We see here the new staffing costs, the supervisor dispatcher still in 2020, and then you'll note that our Saturday service was not added, the evening service starting later, and finally the route deviation service starting later, 2025, than we originally anticipated or desired in our unconstrained plan. For capital, we have, again, carrying forward the funding identified for replacement vehicles, so those are included, cameras, and then anticipating funding for development of the facilities. With the constrained plan, we now have included the projected revenues, and you see those projected revenues included in the lower rows under revenues, and then we have net operating costs with taking out refunds of the fuel tax and others, and the fare revenue, so that the remaining portion has to be what is funded. And so we have, for operations, the local share, the federal share, total state share, and then we have similar lines for capital for federal with our totals, and then a line indicating that in this case our balance, we have balanced the budget, and we're showing that the revenues match the anticipated expenditures. One of the things that you can use this financial plan for is, as conditions change, you can update what service or what changes you may implement or may not. And so, for example, in this case, we had projected a increase in staff of a supervisor and dispatcher with 90,000. If we don't have the funding for that, it may not happen that year, and we would need to go in and make adjustments, taking this out of our 2020 plan and potentially starting 2021, or if we don't think it can happen for 2 years, we may show it starting in 2022. We would then come down and adjust our revenues based on what we had projected, which really would most likely be the driving force as to why we don't put the funding in place and start hiring the additional staff in 2020. I'd like to now turn and talk about the capital budget template. We will look at this template and give you a couple of examples for vehicles and facilities, and then look at what you might do to update the capital budget from year to year. Looking at the capital budget template, it is, again, very detailed. It reflects the capital line item numbers that are used in your MnDOT grant applications. And so you can see on the first line here for fleet, line item number 1711. In this case, all of our fleet costs, direct fleet costs, are for replacement vehicles. And as we come over here, starting at 2020, we have a budget for replacing a couple of vehicles, total cost of $88,000, the federal state portion at $70,400, and a match for 2020 of $17,600. I want to just show an example with how you might make changes to this as your plan moves forward. You can see we have in this cell right here, 40,000. This is under the projected for 2020. We have funding then 40,000 federal state, 10,000 local, for a total of 50,000 to start planning a vehicle storage garage. We might not get all of that, or we might not get any. And this is where you can use the spreadsheet to move forward. So understanding that our cost would be $50,000 for that year, if we have only $30,000 from federal and state, and we still need the $50,000, we might overmatch if we had the funding to maintain that $50,000. The other option might be that we don't get any of this funding, and so instead of starting in this year, what we might want to do is take all of these numbers and basically move them out into a future year. We also might then go back in here and add an inflation factor, because as each year moves forward, we're no longer going to have the same cost. There's going to be a 3%, possibly 5%. You'll have to look at that, but you can take this forward. And the advantage then is that what was your 2020 grant request, now you've identified in your 2021 budget and can include that in your 2021 grant application as we look at that column. I think what you have is the opportunity to create a rolling capital budget. And so if in fact we got 10,000 here, we might put in the actual at this point. So what was, and coming back up to the top, we've got the 2019 budget. At some point here, this would be updated and you'd be showing 2019 actual. We had 2018 actual, 2019 actual, and now we've got 2020 budget as you put your budgets together. And at some point, then 2020 will become the not just budget, well, the actual after you complete 2020. 2021 will become a budget, and you can use this going forward. And as you get to the end of this, start doing an updated 5-year plan. You basically take this template or a similar one and update it for the coming 5 years. So that's our capital budget and how to take that and roll the plan forward. And with that, what we'll do is turn and talk about the operating budget. This one may be the most complex of the spreadsheet templates that we have. I'll give you an overview of that, and then we'll talk about how you may account for changes and look at updating and developing a rolling budget with this. So with that, we will look at the operating budget template. So you should have a template that looks something similar to this. Again, each line item is what comes from the Minnesota DOT, and I think we might want to make this a little bit bigger. You won't see very much of it on the screen, but at least maybe a little easier to read. You can see here the line items, the line item numbering, a brief description of what this is, and then similar to the capital template, we start out and we've got history, 2017, 2018. The 2019, at the time this plan was put together, was projected. You should be closing out 2019, and this should be updated and shown as actual, and then changing the corresponding numbers. So you now have 2019 actual and your local match. There is a built-in inflation figure of 3% per year. In some cases, you may want to change that, and we'll talk about that briefly. So we move across, then we have 2020 projected, and that goes out through 2025. When you have your 2020 budget finalized, I would recommend you come in and change this column to be 2020 budget. And so in the same for the next column, we would have 2020 budgeted local match. And you would then make the changes in the. Now the question is, what do you do if you have something different? So I want to show you where, with our system, when we look at the 2020, what was projected, and we've now changed and said this is our budget. If you look at the 2019, there is a significant increase. The reason for that is that we said we were going to add a supervisor and dispatch. So we've got supervisor, and if we come down to the operations support, we have a big increase reflecting a dispatcher being hired in 2020. Then in future years, that is increased by that inflation factor. But because we had a significant change in the operating costs, we needed to reflect that not as an increase with an inflation factor, but rather as an increase because we've now hired additional staff. You would want to do the same thing if you were making a significant change in service. And so in this example, we were not increasing service significantly in 2020, but in future years, we have a larger increase as we add additional service. And so the operator wages are increased not by the inflation factor, but by an anticipated cost per hour for those operator wages. And then that becomes our future projected budget. We would go down and do similar things as we come down to the operating cost, and we have a line item as we scroll down to where we are looking at fuel in particular would be a large increase, and so again, not by inflation, but increasing. And in some cases, you might want to change the inflation factor for fuel. We've been fortunate in that fuel costs have not increased dramatically in recent years, and the 3% may be a reasonable budgeting increase, but if things change and it looks like we're going to have a much larger increase in fuel costs in an upcoming year, you might want to go into that line and change what you're using for an inflationary increase. Another change might be where you're looking at operator wages, and 3% again is a default inflation factor. If at your system you realize you're paying below what you should be in terms of wages or potentially benefits, then you might want to show a larger increase, that maybe 5% for an upcoming year is more appropriate, and then you go back to 3%. So that is something that you can change in any one of these cells to use then for projecting your future budget. Again, as I said, as we look at each year where 2020 now becomes the budget and 2019 would have been actual, at some point 2020 is going to become actual and 2021 will become your budget. And as you move forward, my suggestion is that you look at these last columns, and what we're going to do is take these columns and just copy them over into our next set of columns. When we do this, this is no longer 2025. We've made this our 2026. And similarly, the local match portion is no longer 2025. That is now the 2026. You can see the inflation factor has carried over, and we project it out, and we still now have a running 5-year budget as we move into 2020. We would repeat that as we move into 2021. And then if in our plan we know we're going to make any significant service changes, we might go in and adjust those numbers to reflect what would be in our service change. This gives you an overview of how you can use this spreadsheet template in your planning and in your budgeting process to develop a budget very easily. The calculations are here. You may need to change some numbers, change some assumptions, change inflation factors, but it is set up so it is calculating all of your line item budget entries to match what you will need to show for your MnDOT grant application. I would note that it would be very good to coordinate your constrained operating budget with your constrained service and financial plan, where you are balancing these costs with your revenues. Again, notice that this is a very detailed sheet, but it gives you the totals. You can take those totals for your various service over to that financial plan sheet that we looked at, where we have the constrained plan, and make sure that the two correspond and that your projected revenues are meeting your projected expenses for each budget year. So that's just a note then on how these can be useful for your grant applications. Once you've updated the templates for your upcoming budget year, you have the information to fill in the budget portions for your grant applications. The line items for both the capital and operating expenses match what MnDOT has in their grant application, and so it's a matter of, once you have your templates updated, simply copying those numbers from your template to your grant application. So as long as you keep the templates up to date year to year, you should be in good standing and a good position to complete your grant application without too much effort, at least on the budget portion. Finally, just to summarize what we have looked at, we covered the various templates, the ones for service planning, really two being there, one looking at needs and demand, and then having a financial plan, a 5-year financial plan showing anticipated costs and revenues, and that financial plan relating directly to your capital budget template and your operating budget template. And I think if you use these templates, you should find that they will help simplify your grant application process. Let me say it has been a pleasure working with systems in Minnesota to put these plans together and to be able to hopefully give you some idea of how you can take advantage of some of the tools that were provided to you as part of this planning effort.